third day of the Paulo Freire Centennial Conference at Columbia University and Teachers College. And today we have an amazing lineup of panelists talking about the work of Paulo Freire and its impact in research, practice, and in academia. And I just want to point out that today we also have some of the co-organizers of the event, Marcela Winter, who is here, Fernanda Diaz, Livia Macedo, and you see them at the end. They are part of the group of students at Teachers College and Columbia who are organizing this event. And we have 2 more days, tomorrow and Thursday. So stay tuned for that as well. So today I want to introduce Sonia Horsford, our moderator for today. So Sonia is a professor of educational leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University, and also a founder of the Black Education Research Collective and a co-director of the Urban Education Leaders Program at Teachers College. And so, Sonia, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to moderate this very special panel, and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in what is a really historic and special occasion in celebrating the life and contributions of Paulo Freire. My name is Sonia Horsford, and I'm a faculty member at Teachers College, and again, really honored to be able to moderate a discussion among some key theorists and leaders who have been inspired and impacted by Paulo Freire, and to learn more about how more specifically his work has impacted their own research and practice, and to hopefully have a conversation as part of this discussion. And so at this time, I want to quickly introduce our panelists. First, we have Carlos Alberto Torres, who is a political sociologist of education, who serves as a distinguished professor of social sciences and comparative education at UCLA. And he is also the director of the Paulo Freire Institute at the UCLA School of Education. Dr. Torres's current research examines the political sociology of education, focusing on the cultural organizational contexts of learning and the tensions resulting from the dialectics of the global and the local in cultural creation in the social sciences. Please welcome Dr. Torres. We also have Leoncio Soares, who is a full professor at Federal University of Minas Gerais. I hope I said that right. Help me, Dr. Latson-Billings.
Minas Gerais.
Minas Gerais. His research focuses on education, public policies, and youth and adult education. He is also a currently visiting scholar at the University of Lisboa. And we welcome Professor Soares. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Professor Gloria Latson-Billings, who serves as a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and faculty affiliate in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Latson-Billings' research examines the pedagogical practices of teachers who are successful with African-American students. From 2005 to 2006, she served as the president of the American Educational Research Association. And I'm sure most, if not all of those who have joined are familiar with her theory of culturally relevant pedagogy, which we're hoping you might speak to today as it's picked up so much steam and to help remind us of the origins of that theory. So at this time, I'm delighted to invite Dr. Torres to give remarks and speak to the theme, which is the guiding question is, how have Paulo Freire's ideas impacted educational research and practice?
Thank you, Sonia. I will provide a political sociological analysis of the main ideas of Freire, and I will leave up to the pedagogues in the group to discuss the implementation at the classroom level. There is no question that Freire today is the educator with the highest international reach in the world. As an example, Elliot Green compiled what he considered the most cited publications in the social sciences and shows that Pedagogy of the Press ranks third in the 25 most cited books in the social sciences after Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of the Scientific Revolution, and Everett Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations. But in fact, Pedagogy of the Oppressed is ranked as the most cited book in the field of education. So following Thomas Kuhn's argument, I will argue that Freire produced a rapid paradigmatic shift in educational sciences and beyond. This paradigmatic shift, I don't have the time to explain all of them in detail, so I will try to speak only 15 minutes to honor the time granted for this presentation. Include, first, his concerns for education as emancipation and the construction of the concept of critical consciousness. This resulted in the metaphor of Pedagogy of the Oppressed as the pedagogy that will facilitate unity in diversity via citizenship creation, and by implication, citizenship schools or public popular schooling. The model of Pedagogy of the Oppressed was also a pioneering work in multiculturalism, particularly chapter 3. Second, a hermeneutics of suspicion. Let me speak about the hermeneutic model for a minute. It's a style of literary interpretation in which texts are read with skepticism in order to expose the purported repressed or hidden meanings. In Freire's epistemology, what is assumed is that every social relationships involve a moment of domination. This hermeneutic of suspicion is very similar to the work of another phenomenologist. Freire was a phenomenologist, French philosopher and professor of the University of Chicago. And I will talk about that in a minute. But essentially what Freire did is also an epistemic deconstruction of education. Therefore, not surprising, Freire is considered one of the originators of an epistemology of the Global South. Fourth, Freire made a fundamental contribution in methodology, being one of the originators on parallel lines to the work of Orlando Falsborda, a Colombian sociologist very distinguished, and both of them created the foundations of a methodological model that is now known as participatory action research. This goes back to the 60s and their concern about a critique of positivism, spiritualism, and the like. Fifth, his early work on social justice education, I have demonstrated in my book, The First Freire, anticipated a new tradition that comes closer to the utopian socialist tradition, but also connects epistemologically and politically with most of the most important, if properly deconstructed, principles of the Enlightenment, particularly two of them: the defense of rationality, which we have lost completely sight of in the context of the post-truth society, and the role of education in humanization. Make no mistake, Freire is a child of the Enlightenment, but one that is very critical of the Enlightenment. Six, his work is ultimately a pedagogy of the earth. In the late 90s, probably 3 or 4 years before he passed away, he talked to some of his friends and he said to me one day, you know, Carlos, there is a missing chapter of pedagogy of the oppressed. It's the chapter of eco-pedagogy. That is the planet as an oppressed entity. And then very recently, I put together all of his analysis on this topic with a former student of mine, Greg Misiazek, and we recreated what would have been the 5th chapter of Pedagogy of the Oppressed in a book I edited, The Wiley Handbook of Paulo Freire. Now, what is important is that Freire used the concept of eco-pedagogy. And eco-pedagogy, in my opinion, is the linchpin of connecting what is an elective affinity, to speak in Bavarian terms, of implementation in the context of global citizenship education and its twin sister sustainability, and type of implementation of policy orientations. Not only in the political ecology model, but also in education. Eco-pedagogy is one of the tools to promote planetarian citizenship, a concept that needs to be more defined in analytical and normative conditions. So in the few minutes left, I would like to focus on the three core concepts of Paulo Freire meta theory. I don't have the time to argue back and forth what is meta theory, but essentially the construction of a language that understands how theory is constructed. So let me say, first, the main concept that inspired Freire at the very beginning is the idea of work, pretty much in the same model that some of the concepts that inspire Marx, but only work in the context of the vision of the world of the subordinate social sectors, what the Germans call Weltanschauung. And I think that he worked on these topics in Brazil, in Chile, visiting the Institute of Ivan Illich in Mexico, in his exile in Europe, in his work in Africa, in the post-colonial countries. And in his return to Brazil, he said to me one day in one of the interviews I had with him, Carlos, I'm coming back to visit with the Gramsci in the favelas. And I thought that was a very good metaphor of looking at the Gramscian thinking in the favelas, the place of the poor. So I think it's very important to recognize a couple of things. Number one, that in this overall picture of Weltanschauung and work, there is the element of alienation. Freire could never fully work around the concept of alienation for a number of reasons I have explained in some of my writing. But I think it's important to realize that the concept of alienation was central to the work of Hegel, to the work of Kant, to the work of Marx, and is still a very central element in the critical theory a la Frankfurt, particularly in the contribution of Rachel, Gaegi, and Hartmut Rose. So I said 40 years ago in one of my first books on Freire that in his early work, Freire had realized on the work of Erich Fromm. And Erich Fromm analysis is very close to the critical theory model a la Frankfurt, despite of the fact that he was expelled from the original work of this Frankfurt School, because not only his psychoanalytical tradition, but particularly because he was very dissatisfied with the pessimism of the original founders, Horkheimer and Adorno. Pessimism that in a way was taken care of by the work of Habermas, the second generation. So assessing the importance of praxis, Freire's pedagogical model uses constant references to the idea of work and to the concept of class struggle. More so at the very beginning, but he never gave up that concept. Why? Because in the analysis of Freire, class struggle is the archetype of the struggle against oppression. There is a whole discussion that will deserve a major paper. We don't have the time for that. Why Freire uses oppression? Why not domination? Why not exploitation? I'm going to give you a hint of what I think. It has to do with his ontological commitment toward his Christianity. Because if you look at the Bible, the concept of oppression is central, much more than any concept that will signify the same element. Now, why Freire was so interested in the concept of Weltanschauung, a worldview? He was interested in the worldview of the subordinate social sectors, be that women, girls, be that the poor, be that people of color. Whatever you define in a particular context, I think it is substantial to understand that the context marks the worldview of the people. And in that situation, we have to understand how we teach in multiple contexts, dealing with multiple worldviews. That is an extraordinary challenge for pedagogues. I'm not a pedagogue, so I just invite people to think about it. But there's another thing that unfortunately is tragic. There is a lot of work of Freire in the 60s and 70s that has never been translated into English. And I had published several books in Portuguese and in Spanish, collecting some of that work. Let me offer you a fascinating quote, my own translation, from work of Paulo Freire that I put in a book 40 years ago called, in Portuguese, Leitura Crítica de Paulo Freire, the critical reading of Paulo Freire. And I quote, "We cannot, unless we are foolish, expect positive results of educative labor that does not respect the people's particular vision of the world and whose program includes a kind of cultural invasion, although done with the best intentions." I'm reminded in this, I stop the quote for a second. I'm reminded in this extraordinary sentence, a very traditional Spanish proverb. The path to hell is built with good intentions. And I think that is what Freire is hinting at. I continue. So, although done with bad intentions, nonetheless, it remains a cultural invasion. One of his analyses on alienation is through cultural invasion. Only by beginning with an actual concrete existential situation, look at the terms, actual concrete existential situation, that reflects the people's choice of aspirations, will be able to work on the programmatic context of education. What we must do is to outline for the people their concrete existential situations as a problem that challenges them per se and therefore demands their response. This response, in turn, has to be given not only on an intellectual level, but in terms of praxis. So here you have another extraordinary suggestion. You cannot do research unless you put it in praxis. How much research is put in practice these days in the US? I wonder. Unfortunately, this meta principle, and this is the first one I want to speak about, did not lead Freire towards an analysis of the political economy of capitalism and its analytical constellation, but that's okay. His training, he's a self-made intellectual. His training was as a lawyer. All he learned was in his personal library, reading philosophy. So, not political economy. However, in the last stages of his life, having fully embraced a model of dialogical, deliberative, and participative radical democracy, confronted the impacts of globalization, and was particularly critical of neoliberalism. Now, without question, Freire pedagogy is a pedagogy for the social movements, with a multitude of experiences with working class movements, women's movements, rural movements like the Sem Terra in Brazil, the movements of literacy training or MUVA Brazil, or the model of participatory budgeting worldwide. Pay attention to the experience of participatory budgeting in Arizona, initiated by a former student of mine, brilliant scholar and practitioner, Daniel Shukurensky, who actually affected deeply the way in which citizenship building is constructed in Arizona schools. Second early meta principle of his work focuses on the theme of communication, which in his initial writings, particularly a book that has been now republished, Education for Critical Consciousness, I think the title of this book is the archetype of the Freire analysis in all his phases and diverse forms of representation. My original analysis identified a few different movements in Freire meta-theoretical work. First, an analytical movement in the construction of critical literacy as a form of social, individual, and collective emancipation, and therefore the concept of conscientization that he adapted from other environments, theology of liberation, philosophy of liberation, pretty much in vogue in Latin America at the time. There is a synthetic movement that is propelled by his appointment as director of the National Commission of Popular Culture in Brazil, in which his model of critical literacy for adults emerged as a model of political education in the construction of democratic citizenship. This model is also a model of inclusion, because it cannot be citizenship without access to the vote. Without inclusion, access to voting, there is no democracy, nor citizenship building in any democracy, because citizenship is linked to the socialization of the social subjects. Then there is an imperative that this socialization at all levels have attention to this question of access. But also education has a fundamental role as an inclusion to create the conditions for this access. And that is one of the reasons that Freire's original work was already a model of multiculturalism that many people have appreciated. The third meta-theoretical principle that Freire embraced throughout his life and work is the defense of democracy as a precondition for social transformation and as a fundamental element for humanization. Freire makes an explicit link between humanization and democratization. He defined these explicit links as an ontological and historical foundation in the political struggle for democracy and its permanent improvement. So imagine how much the call of Freire resonates today in the crisis of democracy in the US. So I have many other things that I want to say, but I will conclude with two sets of premises. So this was Freire in the 60s and 70s. 3 months before he passed away, he gave one of his last interviews. And he talks about the citizenship school. We should really talk about citizenship school. And I quote, "The citizenship school is the one that assumes itself as a center of rights and obligations. What characterizes this school is citizenship education. The citizen school then is the school that helps those citizens who are part of the school and those who come into contact with the school. This citizenship school cannot be a being in and for itself." Notice the Hegelian sentence. I did the translation. I may apologize, but it was a Hegelian sentence, I guarantee. This school is a citizenship school as long as it practices and constructs citizenship by those persons that use this space. You know what that means? The people that work in the school, the parents, the children, the adults, the community. This school is coherent with freedom. It is coherent with this formative discourse, and it's a discourse for liberation. The citizenship school is every school that, while struggling to be by itself, struggle for that students, educators, also to be by themselves. And because nobody can be by itself alone, the citizenship school is a communitarian school, a companionship school. The citizenship school is a school for knowledge and freedom of common production. It is a school that lives the tense experience of democracy. So I will conclude with one sentence that I will borrow from the work of Paul Ricoeur, who was, like Freire, on his same time, elaborating a hermeneutic of suspicion. Let me say this. Freire set our imagination on fire. Freire sets our imagination on fire. Now we can go back to some great elements in the history of literature to talk about the importance of an imagination on fire. But let me use Paul Ricoeur, and I quote Ricoeur. "Imagination works in two different ways. On the one hand, imagination may function to reserve an order. In this case, the function of imagination is to stage a process of identification that mirrors the order. Imagination had the appearance here of a picture. On the other hand, though, imagination may have a disruptive function. It may work as a breakthrough. It's imagine, in this case, is productive, an imagining of something else, the elsewhere. Ideology represents the first kind of imagination. It has a function of preservation, of conservation. Utopia, in contrast, represents the second kind of imagination. It is always the glance from nowhere. My dear friends, Freire was a pilgrimage, in a pilgrimage for a new utopia. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, Professor Torres, for that. You've given us so much to think about, and we look forward to engaging you in a conversation. Up next, we have Professor Soares.
Bem, boa tarde, boa noite, talvez bom dia para quem nos verá também no futuro. Então, inicialmente agradecendo a Universidade de Colômbia, através de toda essa equipe do professor Paulo que está junto, sob a coordenação hoje à noite aí da professora Sônia. Então, agradecendo Renata, Isabela, Marcela, Juliana, Gabriela, Lívia e Fernanda, que possibilita que a gente tenha essa conferência iniciada na semana passada. Nunca se ouviu falar tanto de Paulo Freire em webinários, lives, cursos, disciplinas, encontros e congressos, como no ano em que é celebrado o centenário de seu nascimento. Podemos afirmar que nos sentimos com a alma encharcada. É de se imaginar que, doravante, nenhum estudante de graduação no Brasil desconhecerá quem foi esse renomado pensador brasileiro. Na minha universidade, a Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, realizamos em 2018 o segundo Congresso Internacional Paulo Freire, o Legado Global, reunindo cerca de 500 participantes de todo o Brasil em um momento memorável, antecedendo as comemorações do centenário de nascimento de Freire. Naquele momento, o professor emérito da UFMG, professor Miguel Arroio, expôs um belíssimo texto, o quanto o pensamento de Freire representa um outro paradigma para a educação. Carlos Alberto se referiu a essa questão também do Paulo Freire com um novo paradigma. Durante todo esse ano, como em muitas universidades do Brasil, a Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais constituiu uma comissão do centenário, que, em articulação com professores, estudantes e técnicos administrativos, organizaram disciplinas, palestras, atividades interdisciplinares de pesquisa, convidando professores da educação básica, lideranças indígenas, lideranças de movimentos sociais para tratarem de temáticas relacionadas ao pensamento de Paulo Freire. Em tempos de distopia e de anormalidade, em que nos encontramos cercados de situações limites, falar de Paulo Freire é um bálsamo por tudo que ele significa. Freire, e vou usar o verbo sempre no presente, é um pensador que pensa a vida, denuncia as violações aos direitos dos que são impedidos de viver e anuncia um futuro de possibilidades a ser construído já, agora. Tempos de anormalidade, porque não se pode familiarizar com o que destrói a vida. Chegar ao escandaloso número de mais de 600 mil mortos no Brasil pela pandemia é de nos causar a mais profunda indignação. Chico César, cantor conhecido nosso e da nossa cultura, musicalizou um poema de Braulio Bessa intitulado Inumeráveis, que diz: se números frios não tocam a gente, espero que nomes consigam tocar. E segue trazendo nomes de pessoas reais com seus sonhos, projetos e história. Evoco Freire quando ele diz: constato para mudar e não para me adaptar. Então, esses números, por mais escandalosos que sejam, é um dado. um dado a ser trabalhado no sentido da transformação. A realidade da pandemia a nos desafiar em busca de meios para reduzir os danos causados a tantas famílias, vidas que poderiam ser poupadas. A questão que nos foi colocada para esta mesa é: como as ideias de Paulo Freire impactam a pesquisa e a prática educativa? No que se refere à pesquisa, acrescentaria mais algumas questões, como o Carlos também chegou a fazer. Se a pesquisa proposta é ou não relevante frente à realidade que vivemos. Se ela faz sentido. Em que irá contribuir? Em que irá auxiliar para conhecer melhor os sujeitos em seu contexto? Em que irá ajudar a desvelar as razões, as causas que mantêm a opressão? Freire pensa as pessoas não como objeto, mas como sujeito histórico. Não é o futuro que nos faz, nós é que nos fazemos ao construir o futuro. Ao colocar o sujeito no centro, os homens e mulheres se assumem como problema. Assim como disse Fernando Haddad na abertura dessa conferência, Freire foi em busca de uma originalidade ao propor a visão de homem como ser projetivo, ser que pensa à frente de seu tempo. Na pesquisa, há que se problematizar as situações em que os sujeitos se encontram impedidos de ser. Nas palavras de Freire, quais as situações limites que nos parecem intransponíveis? Assistimos de modo surpreendente como o pensamento de Freire vem sendo incorporado pelas mais variadas áreas, da saúde, do trabalho, do campo, do serviço social, do meio ambiente, do direito, da psicologia social, da comunicação e, óbvio, da própria educação. É como a metáfora que Gilberto Gil utilizou no primeiro dia. Diz o Gilberto: Freire chegou para mim como o oceano chega na praia, dado a sua imensidão. E completou: ele é para mim um aprendiz permanente. Característica destacada também por Aci Lumumba, da Cornell University, ao referir a passagem de Freire nos países africanos onde trabalhou. Um dos pensamentos de Freire mais citado é: se a educação sozinha não transforma a sociedade, sem ela tampouco a sociedade muda. Nessa perspectiva, a prática educativa altera, modifica o fazer da escola, da educação. Nos anos 70 e 80 do século passado, a sociologia denunciava a cumplicidade da educação com a reprodução das condições de vida a que as pessoas estavam submetidas, como salientou Luísa Cortesão em sua fala no segundo dia da conferência. Em 1979, a banda de rock Pink Floyd lançou o álbum The Wall, em evidente crítica aos modelos escolares em que predominavam os comportamentos de castigo e punição, em uma concepção de escola repressora, em que os estudantes eram tratados como objetos, no dizer da música, como meros tijolos na parede. A prática educativa, tópico importante nos escritos de Freire sobre as experiências vividas enquanto secretário de Educação da cidade de São Paulo no final dos anos 80 e início dos anos 90, livro do qual o Carlos Alberto Torres participou, intitulado Educação na Cidade, em que Freire enfatiza a necessidade do fazer da escola se aproximar da vida dos estudantes. Essa aproximação da realidade dos estudantes traria elementos para uma reformulação curricular, visando superar a concepção bancária bastante presente nas práticas educativas. Esta preocupação de Freire se mantém atual, dadas as resistências encontradas nos sistemas educativos em direção a alguma mudança. Não por acaso, em evento na Argentina, em julho passado, que reuniu cerca de 20 países em preparação à Conferência Internacional de Educação de Adultos, a ser realizada em Marrocos no ano que vem, um dos pontos discutidos discutido, se deteve a seguinte afirmação: tornar a educação popular mais pública e a educação pública mais popular, em uma clara referência à contribuição de Freire. Uma das maiores contribuições dele, que levou ao avanço nas ciências da educação, está em chamar atenção para reconhecer nas pessoas, sobretudo das camadas populares, o fato de serem sujeitos de cultura, sujeitos de saber, sujeitos de conhecimento, ideia antes reservada somente àqueles considerados letrados na sociedade. Como dito no início dessa fala, celebrar 100 anos do nascimento de Freire tem sido um bálsamo. Assim como este evento na Columbia University, o ano de 2021 está sendo marcado por iniciativas de toda a natureza em várias partes do mundo. O próprio Instituto Paulo Freire, do qual o Carlos faz parte, já vem realizando importante trabalho de memória e divulgação da vida e obra de Freire, e que neste ano se multiplicou exponencialmente. Muitas e muitos foram os convidados a participar de lives cuja temática envolvia Freire. Para além do time do Instituto Paulo Freire, muitos de nós assistimos Anita Freire, Carlos Rodrigues Brandão, Oscar Rara, Sérgio Haddad, Eliane Santiago, Balduino Andreola, Osmar Fávero, Elza Folkenbaum, Edna Castro e dos filhos de Paula, Ludgardes, Madalena e Fátima. Iniciativas como Café Paulo Freire, as plenárias dos fóruns de EJA, o Fórum de Leitores de Freires no sul do país, a Nova Primavera, os inúmeros grupos de leitura surgidos nas igrejas, nos grupos populares e nos movimentos sociais, recolocaram Freire na pauta no dia. Seu nome é lembrado como sinal de resistência em tempos sombrios, e sua inspiração está representado no verbo esperançar, dito aos quatro cantos. Aqui em Portugal, a Associação Portuguesa para a Cultura e Educação Permanente realizou em julho um seminário com Licínio Lima com o tema Do Pensamento de Paulo Freire à Atualidade da Educação Permanente. Assisti à aula do professor Rui Canário, que ao abordar seu clássico livro Educação de Adultos, Um Campo, Uma Problemática, fez várias essa semana em seminário no Instituto de Educação da Universidade de Lisboa. O professor Antônio Nova citou Freire ao divulgar o mais recente relatório da Unesco para a Educação, cujo título é Repensar Juntos os Nossos Futuros. No dia 19 de setembro, dia do nascimento de Freire, na cidade do Recife, onde Freire nasceu, a Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, onde Freire trabalhou, fez uma inesquecível homenagem ao estilo de Freire, com o cantor Alceu Valença cantando e abrindo alas para a cultura popular passar. Nesta ocasião, estava na Universidade Federal da Paraíba como professor visitante, quando presenciei uma articulação entre o Centro de Educação e gestores de vários municípios que haviam se formado naquela universidade. Foi de sentir orgulho de ouvir como os egressos carregavam consigo uma formação com base na ação dialógica e no respeito e valorização da diversidade humana atribuídos ao processo formativo naquela instituição. Não é à toa que, no ano que se celebra o centenário de seu nascimento, Freire vem sendo evocado como pensador, que ao longo da vida denunciou e lutou contra as mais diversas formas de opressão e, sobretudo, semeou esperança ao afirmar em muitos dos seus trabalhos que mudar é difícil, mas é possível.
Thank you, Professor Soares, for your insightful remarks and to remind us that schools can serve as sites of resistance and transformation in line with Freire's work. And at this time, I want to invite Professor Ladson-Billings to share her remarks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, boa tarde. so delighted to be here with this amazing group of scholars. Thank you, Professor Horsford, for moderating, and my Stanford classmate, Carlos Alberto Torres. Always, Elliot Eisner used to always say, don't look at us, look at the people who are sitting beside you, because they will make the difference. And Carlos is a wonderful example of that. And also to Professor Soros, thank you for allowing me to be on the panel along with you. I'm going to give a brief shout out to my colleagues at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, my former student, Julio Dinez Pereira. We were on a panel last week. And to all of my friends down there in Porto Alegre, I should say up there, because who says down is south is down, right? So up there in Porto Alegre, as well as just want to note one of a longtime dear friend, Professor Petronelia Gonzalez y Silva, who was perhaps the first Black woman to be a professor at a federal university. So the issue of race is an international one, and it took some time for someone like Petro to be able to move into the academy. I want to talk about a couple of encounters with Paulo Freire. My first encounter with Paulo Freire was actually not Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I've literally said to some of my students that Pedagogy of the Oppressed has become the coffee table book. Everybody's got it. Nobody's read it. I actually give a prize to a student to read the whole book, because everybody cites it. It's in everybody's dissertation. But I'm like, do you really understand what's in this book? So my first encounter was not Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Actually, it was his work, and it was an anthropology class I'd taken at Stanford. It was his work in Guinea-Bissau. So I was captivated by the fact that here was this man in exile in Africa, trying to ensure that these people could fight for their own liberation. My second encounter was actually a face-to-face encounter. And that one was at Santa Clara University. I was an assistant professor, excited that we were able to bring him, and he was debuting a film about what it meant to teach people some things that were so basic to their everyday lives. Not to, quote, go on to secondary education or tertiary education, but rather to be able to fight for their own liberation. My third encounter with Paulo Freire was at the American Educational Research Association annual meeting. And by that time, he had returned to Brazil, was working in the government, and he said, you know, Gloria, it's difficult to ride two horses at the same time. And I'll never forget that, because it's always reminded me that on the one hand, we fall into these institutions without being critical about what these institutions are doing in the world. I was really glad to hear Carlos talk about the whole environmental challenge, because that's really the thing that our young people are deeply concerned with. There was a study recently done at the University of Bath that surveyed over 10,000 young people, and their number one concern is the environment and the fact that the adults that are supposed to be in charge are not doing anything about it. So here was Freire reminding me that, yeah, you can go into an institution, but you may not be able to do the same kind of liberatory work you want to do, because the institution's not set up for liberation. Institutions are set up for conservation, for staying the way they are. But I was really struck by his work over the time that I've had the chance to study him, because it always reminded me of the work of Septima Poncet Clark. A lot of people don't know Septima Clark, but she understood the pedagogical genius of everyday Black people, who are what we might call organic intellectuals, not public intellectuals, not people standing up, picking up big checks and being rewarded because they say something out in public, but people who are on the ground working day to day to ensure that people get freedom and justice. And these people became really the leaders of the United States civil rights movement. People like Fannie Lou Hamer and Hosea Williams, Rosa Parks, and their development of, it's going to sound very familiar, citizenship schools in the 1950s. So there's been a wonderful, I think, confluence of thinking in Brazil and thinking in the US South that begins to say, what does it take for people to be able to really be liberated? Freire's work, I think, has revealed to me the significance of pedagogy over curriculum. We often have curriculum fights. We often talk about the what, but we rarely talk about the how. And it was Freire who I think brought that to our consciousness, that you got to think about how you're going to do this. I have seen, quote, wonderful curriculum totally destroyed because they didn't have a good pedagogue to be able to implement it. I also want to just remind us that I think Freire operates in a tradition. The tendency, at least in the US, is to pick out the one individual and lift that person. So if you talk to most teachers who were trained in the US, they will recognize the name John Dewey, as if nobody else did anything. Or that as if Dewey was the only person really concerned about, quote, the whole child, or as if Dewey were the only one who was thinking about sort of the curriculum and pedagogy in action. But if you look at Freire's pedigree, you're going to find folks like Amilcar Cabral, right? You're going to find folks like Frantz Fanon, Septima Clark, that there is a lineage. And I think the important thing about that is that that work invites us to engage in what I would call loving critique. Some years ago, James Frazier, Tanya McKinnon, and others put together a volume called Mentoring the Mentor. And we were invited to write critical essays to Paulo Freire about his work. And I wrote an essay in that book called I Know Why This Doesn't Feel Empowering, which talked about the way race is absent from the discussion of his work. Now, ultimately, what we were supposed to do, or what was supposed to happen, is that he was supposed to write back to us. But by that time, he was not in the kind of physical condition where he could actually do that. But we published the book anyway. You know, I think he would want us to be critical. He would, if he were still living, he would want us to be pushing his ideas, not freezing them, not keeping them in a state where they can't be examined. His work, I think, is probably better understood in adult education and better implemented in adult education than, you know, K-12 education as we know it. It's probably better seen in places like theology and even healthcare. So in many ways, those of us who are in the so-called mainstream education, we have squandered this legacy. So one of the things that I hope we will do in this next century is go back and recapture it, to make better use of it and to make better sense of it. My own work has been deeply influenced by it. You know, I came out of graduate school believing curriculum was the place, right? I got a degree in curriculum. But I learned quickly that the pedagogy mattered so much more. The way in which we bring the learner along, the way in which we help them understand their own power. And I think it is pretty amazing that right now, some of the work that I have the opportunity to do is so grounded in popular culture. So much of the work that we are doing with hip hop studies, this is about folks on the streets telling us what's real. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Paulo Freire can be credited for. So I'm going to stop right there because I think, it'd be really great if we have some conversation. And I just want to, again, acknowledge that I think, this is me, but I think that he would love for us to engage in loving critique.
Thank you, Professor Gloria. So at this time, we'll open the floor to a conversation. We have a couple of questions that have been provided in the chat. I'll read the first. It is, what can we learn from Freire about current approaches to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher education and broader society? Some advocate for dismantling systems that historically have prevented access to the very capitalist system that create and reproduce oppression. What can we do when oppressed communities ask for greater access into systems that can only generate through human alienation a false sense of human fulfillment? And I think Professor Ladson-Billings, you were speaking to this in terms of the role of institutions, in terms of conservation as opposed to liberation. Maybe you can start with that and then we can invite others to respond as well.
Okay, thank you. There's one of the things that I have been tasked with doing at the University of Wisconsin is actually helping the medical school with people who are leaving the medical practice to come into academic medicine. So these are folks who they were practicing physicians and now they want to be professors. And it's a difficult transition for them. But the first lesson that I give them that I think is sort of interesting is I tell them, listen, the institution has no capacity to love you back. And they're like, what? Because they've been in a world where their patients love them, the nurses love them, their receptionists love them. Institution can't do it. The second lesson I tell them is that the institution has an unlimited amount of time to reach its goals. So you go back and read those mission statements. They've been doing the same thing since 18 or 1700s, right? Same old stuff, and they'll keep doing it into the 22nd, 23rd century. Most of us have about a 6-year window to get something done. So we have to recognize that the institution, there's certain things that we're asking institutions to do that they're just not capable of doing. Given that, the question becomes, how can we, quote, do our work? And I want to make a distinction here. How can we do our work at the place we have a job? Those are not the same places. I used to tell students all the time, if the University of Wisconsin fires me tomorrow, I'll still have work. Now, I won't have a job, but I'll have work. And so understanding this broader concept of the work that we are here to do, the mission that we are on, is, I think, an important aspect of what Freire was trying to convey, that you cannot be defined solely by these institutions.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond? I'll move on to the next question because we have a couple more. Okay. So this question asks, with the works of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Pedagogy of Hope, and Pedagogy of Autonomy, we can understand a trilogy that manages to involve Freire's thought. In this context, does the theory that encompasses his praxis still reach the frontiers of knowledge and of school environments and spaces beyond the school walls? Professor Torres, would you mind responding to that question?
It's a very broad question, but I will argue that first, there is an immense challenge at every level of the school system to both recognize, understand, and honor the cultural traditions of the students who come into the school, while at the same time making them aware of the elements that I will call the highbrow culture of the scientific thinking. So there is a very systematic crisis in how to connect between what we consider people should learn and understand from the experience of the people that come, and they have multiple avenues and layers of knowledge and wisdom. That in itself is one of the greatest challenges beyond Freire, because Freire gave us some indications, but since his first question and answer is look at the context and figure out what the generative themes are, then once you get at that point, really the curriculum have to be custom made. That's what we did when I was his advisor in the Ministry of Education in Sao Paulo. About 20% of the Sao Paulo schools were building curriculum around conversation with the communities and figuring out what they want to do. I know that it looks a little bit disorganized, but on the other hand, it's extraordinarily democratic. And democracy is always a tense situation. Second and last observation, I think at this point in time, one of the things that I have said consistently is that when you begin teaching, you are a robot, right? You were pumped in your head tons of things to do, how to do it, and so on. A lot of science, doesn't matter. You are a robot. And as a robot, you are ready to make all sorts of mistakes, which in a way you learn by making mistakes, particularly why you make the same mistake when there are many so new mistakes to make. So in a way, that is exactly the process of learning and teaching. So recognizing those problems are central. But there is one element in which you could not make a mistake. And it's not to recognize what your students bring to you in your classroom. And that goes all across from elementary education to higher education. Now, how do you do that? Do you do that by following a particular curriculum? Do you do that by following a particular method? No, you do that by following the most simple and more humane element of human life, the paideia. The love for knowledge implies the love for your students. And when you combine both of them, then you listen more than you talk. Although you must talk at some point, after all, they pay you for that. But you have to really figure out who are you talking to and why. Now, I understand that sometimes the bureaucracy is so prominent that creates the iron cage of which, to cite Beverly again today, of which we live surrounded by this iron cage. But I must tell you, I think one of the best experiences I ever had in my life at UCLA, but of course, it's a great university. We have a lot of latitude. I decided to do this. Being a distinguished professor, I imagine people will figure out that I got that not by chance. So I went to a classroom with 7 students and said, listen guys, I don't have it's a class about Freire, I don't have a syllabus. So the first task is to build the syllabus. So they spend the first week on their own, come back, and between the 7 of them and myself, we built the syllabus. So I said, okay, the second task is to list the readings. But remember, I should know some of those readings because there is a limit of how much I can do in a quarter. So we make a negotiation and we listed the readings. My last point was, all right, how we do the evaluation? I said in my worst moment of liberalism, I think you should evaluate yourself. And you tell me, what is the evaluation? Almost unanimously, everyone said, no, professor, you should evaluate us because the students are terrible evaluating the students. So I said, okay, you give me a whole power, I will use it. democratically. After all, they pay me for teaching this course. And we have one of the best courses I taught in my life. Of course, if this is known widely in the university, I might be in trouble. But on the other hand, those experiences are worth a while.
Thank you, Professor. We need more love in the process, it sounds like. Yes, indeed.
Eu queria responder também, junto a isso, sobre o impacto da teoria de Freire, porque tem a ver com a pergunta da noite de hoje, né? Qual o impacto na pesquisa e qual o impacto na prática pedagógica, né? E acho que o exemplo que o Carlos deu auxilia muito. Primeiramente, assim, quando o próprio Carlos afirma que muito da produção e do pensamento do Paulo Freire, muito contribui e se volta para o fortalecimento dos movimentos sociais. Então, isso continua sendo uma ênfase pelo mundo como um todo, né? Freire é lido, é discutido, é refletido, é incorporado e às vezes é até nomeado. Um movimento passa a ter o nome, o movimento que é Paulo Freire. A escola passa a ter o nome Paulo Freire. Né? Um clube de leitura, Paulo Freire. Então, esse impacto das suas ideias, do seu pensamento, ele continua tendo uma aceitação muito grande nos movimentos. Não é à toa que em uma das suas entrevistas antes de morrer, o Carlos citou da passagem deles antes de ir a Harvard, eu não sei se coincide da mesma entrevista, mas uma das que ele deu foi publicada num livro chamado Os Contestadores. Então, daí, a figura do Freire exatamente assumindo esse lugar na sociedade, de contestar uma ordem que é injusta, para citar um pouco o que a Glória falou também sobre justiça social. Mas eu queria trazer um pouco também, Carlos, de uma experiência na Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, desde 2006, que por expectativa e por demanda dos estudantes, criou-se também um curso de Paulo Freire na pós-graduação. Fernanda, inclusive, chegou a participar desse curso. Fernanda que está presente nos acompanhando. Como o pedido veio dos estudantes, então o primeiro momento foi ouvi-los. Por que querer estudar Paulo Freire? O que querer estudar com Paulo Freire? Que expectativa que vocês têm de Paulo Freire das pesquisas que vocês estão fazendo? Então, iniciamos um primeiro semestre desse jeito e muito na linha que você foi falando. Então, inicialmente, ouvi-los. Então, qual a expectativa? Depois, como é que poderíamos dar esse retorno a ele? Fizemos uma leitura em conjunto de resenhas dos diversos livros de Paulo Freire e escolhemos um para poder trabalhar. A Glória já vai entender que esse escolhido é aquele que fica na cabeceira, Pedagogia do Oprimido. Mas foi importante porque eles falavam assim, eu tentei ler sozinho, mas é muito difícil. Então eu queria ter uma experiência de poder ler em conjunto. E aí, entre esses grupos, tinham estudantes chilenos, argentinos, colombianos, cubanos, e que queriam ter uma experiência de ler Paulo Freire no seu próprio país. E assim organizamos, então, o próprio curso, com a participação em dupla, em trio, de que pegavam uma parte do livro e faziam seminários participados. Essa parte ficou registrada, e aí é interessante essa parte também, Carlos, porque ficavam 2 ou 3 estudantes por conta de registrar a discussão que acontecia no momento da aula, para eles perceberem como também eles são portadores de saberes, como também eles são portadores de conhecimentos. E aí traziam das suas áreas, área da saúde, área das artes, área das ciências exatas, o tipo de interface que a pesquisa deles podia fazer com Paulo Freire. Muitos mostraram que tiveram uma certa resistência ao curso, Carlos. Por quê? Porque nas suas unidades, a matriz curricular é outra. É o professor na frente e o estudante aqui só ouvindo e o professor, só ele é que sabe. Então, alguns falavam, eu tenho resistência a esse forma, porque acho que só o professor sabe, só o professor diz. Então, faziam um trabalho de desconstrução da matriz que tinha de aprendizagem para, então, poder participar em conjunto. E, por último, isso que você citou, a questão da avaliação, a avaliação também foi um ponto para ser coerente. Se era discussão de Paulo Freire, pegando os seus princípios e os seus pressupostos, a avaliação tinha que acompanhar. Então, o primeiro ponto forte da avaliação era a própria participação, o envolvimento. O segundo era o que daquela discussão e daquelas leituras eles estavam apropriando para desenvolverem suas pesquisas. Então, disso respondiam e daí vinha essa avaliação final. Mas assim, é interessante porque aí nós estamos falando de iniciativas no interior da própria universidade, onde o Paulo Freire já teve muita resistência. A gente lembra com facilidade a resistência de uma direita e uma resistência de conservadores, como quando citam que Paulo Freire é um agitador, um subversivo, e às vezes a gente esquece de falar dessa resistência da esquerda quando vê no Paulo Freire um idealista, um sonhador que não vai contribuir com transformação social.
Thank you, Professor Soares. We have a question that speaks directly to the fact that privatization continues to grow in education, and that private schools are increasingly finding it difficult to sustain themselves beyond a clientelistic logic. How can Paulo Freire's work serve as a basis for offering resistance to the logic of the market? Who would like to take that one?
I'm not sure I'm going to speak directly to that, but what I will say is that we're in a moment because of these pandemics, and I have an S on the word pandemic. Clearly we have coronavirus, right? I don't have to argue about that one, but I would say we also have a pandemic of racism. That it is a pandemic because it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's not local, it's everywhere. The third pandemic that I would argue that we are in the midst of is a coming economic collapse. You know, we're doing whatever we can to prop stuff up. Here in the US, the Congress has passed certain things, but, you know, people are still looking at foreclosures and evictions. People have food insecurity. I mean, the economic situation, and it is a pandemic because once again, we're in an international global economic environment. And then the fourth one I alluded to earlier, and that is environmental catastrophe. Now, all of these things are happening at the same time, but I'm really heartened by the work of Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, when she says the pandemic is a portal. It actually can serve as a dividing line between the old world and the new. To the extent that all we want to do is, quote, get back to normal, we will fail. Because normal was horrible for so many of our youngsters. Normal was horrible schooling experience for most kids who are poor, for kids who are kids of color, kids of immigrant status, kids whose first language is other than English in the US. So why go back to normal? There's an opportunity to go to new. The problem is people think that the only new is privatization. We saw that in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. When people were talking about getting back to normal, who would want to go back to what New Orleans was like? New Orleans was horrible before Katrina, but people wanted to get back to that. And as a consequence, the neoliberals rushed in and said, hey, no, we got a new thing here. Look at this new shiny thing we got, all these charter schools. And people went towards that. And I think if we squander this particular opportunity, we're going to have the same situation happen again. You don't get these moments all the time. And I think this is just such a pivotal moment in the history of the world, really, for us to, and the term I've used is to have a hard reset, to just say, look, let's stop, let's reset this thing, and let's make some different choices. So, and those choices, I don't think have to be private choices.
Thank you. I'd actually like to maybe follow up on this question around what do we do as we think about the pandemics and how it's affected society globally, how it's also affected education, and are there ways, how do we engage in the hard reset? And what are some of the things that educators who are working within systems and institutions, what does that work look like, and how might we take a Freirean philosophy and approach to ensuring that we don't go back to normal, but that we're creating something new within these complex systems? Would anyone like to give us our marching orders?
Well, we are looking for a new normal, right? Every time there is a crisis, there is a new normal. So the new normal will not be the old normal. Now, what is this new normal in the context of the impact of the pandemic over 2 years? I think that one element of this new normal is that children have been deprived of learning, and therefore we cannot forecast a process of learning assuming that there was no interruption. So I think the new normal has to take into account the fact that the experience, even through the digital pedagogy, has not been successful, and partly because when the parents could go to work, nobody supervising the children. And the children turn on the television and then turn on the computer, and the computer is looking at the work that is done in the classroom, and the kid may be playing games. So the first element of this new normal is to recognize that there has been a serious learning impact. The second thing of this new normal is to recognize that this pandemic will never go away. Look at the parallels. In the 80s, we discovered a big virus that affected particularly certain sectors of the society, HIV. And now we are living with that virus, and many people are living with that virus inside them, and we're still here. Second element, this pandemic is not going to go away. Number three, we have to recognize that apropos of the pandemic, the planet began to heal itself because we did not drive our cars. And the hole in the southern cone of the ozone layer began to close itself. The planet healed itself. So the Anthropocene is an attempt to figure out how we stop damaging the environment. Fourth, I think there is one very clear learning of this situation, and that is peace is a treasure of humanity. And we need to create an evolving process of peace throughout the world. The next world may eliminate a substantial part of the population in particular areas, the buildings in particular areas, the ability to produce even the agribusiness in particular areas. In other terms, one of the learnings for me of this pandemic that should be a global learning is that the great problem of addressing the crisis is the lack of global solidarity. And one of the elements of this lack of global solidarity has been the political competition across different groups and particularly different countries. In synthesis, the new normal requires a very serious discussion, but we are not going to implement that if we keep fighting among ourselves. What is the next war coming up? In Ukraine. And that could be serious war because one of the contenders have atomic bombs. So we are now at a point of no return in the future of our civilizations, unless we create an evolving peace in which the individuals negotiate the differences through a new social contract. We are done.
Sonia?
Yes.
I want to answer this question. Quando conversamos aqui de que Freire nos convida a olhar o nosso entorno, a nossa realidade, o nosso contexto. Se a realidade está sendo a realidade da pandemia, isso é um conteúdo. Desse conteúdo tem desafios. Em meio a conhecer, a enfrentar esses desafios, tem aprendizagens. Então, como se falou aqui, um dos trabalhos de Freire com suas equipes, quando ia a campo, era conhecer a comunidade, fazer um levantamento do vocabulário dessa comunidade e dali extrair palavra ou temas geradores. A pandemia é um tema gerador. Me impressionou muito no Brasil quando algumas escolas começaram a retornar depois de um longo período de isolamento social e muitos dos professores sequer tocavam no assunto do que tinha ocorrido durante todo aquele período. Como se os estudantes, no caso do Brasil, no mês de março, como se os estudantes tivessem ficado congelados em março, não tivessem aprendido nada até agosto, quando algumas escolas retornaram, como se nada tivesse passado na vida deles. E muitos tiveram experiências pessoais, experiências familiares, experiências comunitárias de grande importância para sua existência e para a solidariedade, como o Carlos chegava a dizer aqui. Então, a pandemia em si, ela é uma aprendizagem planetária nesse momento, né? Quantos de nós tivemos que aprender a cuidar de nós mesmos, né? Ainda ontem, em uma sala de aula, aqui no Instituto de Educação da Universidade de Lisboa, trabalhamos esse tema com as estudantes de Ciência da Educação. E elas traziam situações concretas, vividas em casa, em que elas tiveram que enfrentar. Então, por exemplo, uma de que os pais precisavam trabalhar e ela ficou em casa com meninos mais novos, com irmãos mais novos, e um deles era deficiente. E ela teve que aprender a cuidar disso. Ora, foi uma experiência humana que, quando ela avalia, ela fala, eu não sabia fazer e aprendi a fazer. Uma outra relatava uma situação de muita tensão, de que a mãe, ao precisar trabalhar, aumentou o tempo de trabalho dessa mãe. E com isso ela chegava em casa mais estressada. E ela, como jovem, começou a ver uma possibilidade de fazer atividades para relaxar, para deixar a mãe mais tranquila, para que a mãe dali não passasse por uma situação pior, uma situação de depressão. Bom, isso no âmbito familiar, no âmbito menor. Imagine isso associado às aprendizagens da saúde. Aprender a fazer uso de máscara, aprender a ter o distanciamento, aprender a fazer o uso do álcool em gel, aprender a tomar cuidado com o vírus e ver que passos podemos dar para frente. Então, assim, para lembrar aí, como é que até nisso, quando fala do impacto de Freire, né? Quando fala que Freire pensa a vida, então, às vezes, uma das situações que a gente depara com a escola distante da realidade é exatamente ela não auxiliar a pensar a vida, né? Então, parece algo que seria simples, né? Eu mesmo, né, me preocupei muito nessa época, perguntando tanto aos meus filhos quanto aos seus colegas, mas escuta, vocês voltaram à escola e não se fez uma pergunta, o que aconteceu nesse período? Melhor ainda, o que vocês aprenderam nesse período? Não, muitos professores pediram para abrir o livro na página em que tinham parado. Volto a dizer, como se eles tivessem ficado congelados nesse período.
Thank you, Professor. I actually have a follow-up question for you as well, from a participant. It says, as Dr. Ladson-Billings shared, Freire's concepts are better implemented in adult education. Is there a place for these concepts to be implemented in pre-K-12? And if so, what recommendations would you have to make this happen? That was for Professor Soares.
That was for me.
No, for Soares. I'm sorry.
Soares, yes. For Leôncio.
I've got one queued up for you.
Se esses conceitos podem ser implementados também na educação básica. Sim. Eis uma questão que precisamos ajudar a desmontar. Glória e Carlos estão aqui juntos nessa tarefa, que é desmontar a ideia de que a contribuição do pensamento de Paulo Freire foi só para adultos. Né? Esse livro que Carlos contribuiu para ajudar Freire a escrever, A Educação na Cidade, traz exatamente a experiência da escola pública. E da escola pública com todas as idades, desde as crianças, passando pelos jovens e até os adultos. Em um dos capítulos, olha o título: Para mudar a cara da escola. Então, isso porque Freire deparava com um modelo de escola que ele critica, que é exatamente a educação bancária. Então, mudar essa forma da escola, entre as maneiras, o currículo é uma delas. Então, aquilo que Freire fala do educador ter um momento de audição, de escuta, de prestar atenção na expectativa dos seus estudantes. Ora, isso é para qualquer idade, enquanto se estuda. Depois, reconhecer que os estudantes também sabem, que os estudantes têm conhecimentos, e dependendo do envolvimento cultural que esse estudante tem, é muito superior ao que o professor tem. Então, esse é um segundo ponto. Um terceiro, de que a educação é um ato de participação. Então, a aula diretiva, a aula expositiva, ela tem um momento dela acontecer. Agora, a escola toda ser só expositiva, ser só diretiva, ela elimina a parte da formação. E essa formação voltada para uma autonomia, que aí é o último livro que o Paulo Freire escreveu em vida, né? Pedagogia da Autonomia, exatamente dizendo quais são os saberes necessários para se desenvolver uma prática educativa, que é até o tema da nossa mesa de hoje. Quais os impactos na prática educativa? Então, respondendo, Sônia, sim, né, esses fundamentos e esses pressupostos de Freire são tanto para a educação nos seus diversos níveis, como também para a educação formal, não formal e informal.
So it covers it all.
And
Thank you for clarifying.
Sonia, can I just say that, the statement that I made about it's being better implemented in adult education doesn't mean it hasn't been implemented in PK-12. The work that Curtis Acosta and those folks in Tucson did with La Raza and the Precious Knowledge curriculum, perfect example of this work. And in fact, they actually read Paulo Freire in that high school in Tucson Unified School District. But at a much earlier level, I think if you read something like Bill Ayers to Teach, what he was doing with very young children, kindergartners, really reflects that very same sort of Freirean indication or influence. So it's not that it doesn't happen there. It's that, remember, particularly in the US, capitalism reigns supreme. People got to sell textbooks, and these textbooks are not oriented towards our children's lives. They create some ideal state out there that suggests that this is the way the world is. There's school districts and these institutions buy these texts and people teach from them. It is the kind of, Ivan Ilyich told us many, many years ago, it is the de-skilling of the teacher that, we don't want you to think about anything. So in those places where teachers continue to exercise this autonomy and independent thinking, you can see it at any grade level.
And can I ask a follow-up? What are the implications for teacher and leader preparation as we talk about making these shifts pedagogically, and what does it mean for how we're preparing educators within these institutions?
So now you're opening up a big Pandora's box, right? Or
With 2
can of
minutes left.
worms, or whatever you want to call it, because it says something about the nature of teacher educators. Most of whom can talk about this stuff from the standpoint of they'll point you to the book, but they don't actually. We ask them we're asking young candidates to do something that they've had no experience with. Something as simple as cooperative learning, we don't even do it with them when we prepare them. So I think, it's like one of those balls of string. How far back do you want to unwind it? The teacher education programs have been woeful in their preparation of really critical thinkers and a disposition towards criticality. It just doesn't happen.
Thank you. That didn't create too much controversy. There was a question here for Professor Torres about, I'm trying to find it, Freire's Christian kind of background and how you believe that informed kind of his conceptions, and I hope I'm paraphrasing this correctly, just in terms of his philosophy around democracy and liberation. Could you speak a little bit to that in terms of his own belief systems and how they shaped his work? And I think we have about 2 minutes left.
Well, in 1 minute, I should say that the principles of theology of liberation is to make a fundamental choice, and is to work on behalf of the poor. And therefore, what Freire did, he began to look at the face of the poor in the oppressed and use the notion of oppression to explain from I would say, a strong Christian perspective, the need for being able to help and soothe the conditions of oppression and eventually reverse it. But he did one more step, which is to imagine that the epistemology of the oppressed is to give the oppressed the possibility to recondition their own world. And that in itself was another great contribution of Freire.
And I think that's a powerful way to wrap up this discussion. I'll give each of you maybe 30 seconds to give any closing remarks that you have related to our topic in terms of Freire's impact on educational research and practice.
Well, just to thank the organization for the opportunity to be here, for the pleasure to see Gloria, whom I haven't seen for more than 2 decades, and of course, Leoncio. And honestly, it's been a pleasure because the level of engagement was an extraordinary level of academic conversation, and that is not very common.
Thank you, Professor Torres.
I would also like to just say thank you, but what I think is really important about what we've done here this afternoon, evening, is really point towards the internationalization of the work. We tend to work in these silos, and Americans are among the most ethnocentric people on the face of the planet. We think, well, we just talk to each other. So I think the fact that we have colleagues here from the Southern Hemisphere, we have colleagues from other parts of the world, that we are simulcasting in English and Spanish and Portuguese, wonderful. Because that's exactly the kind of thing that I think Paulo Freire would be proud of.
Beautiful. And Professor Soares?
Sim, bom, agradeço novamente e parabenizo a iniciativa da Columbia University, através de Sônia, através de Paulo e toda essa equipe, por ter possibilitado, e ainda continua, amanhã e depois de amanhã ainda mais 2 conferências. Falar do prazer de rever Carlos Alberto Torres, de conhecer Glória, que estaria com a gente em 2018 na UFMG, mas não foi possível, e de dizer que isso gera um movimento. Eu citei aqui a Confinteia, que é a conferência que vai acontecer em Marrocos, que tem a ver com a área da educação de adultos. Então, é uma oportunidade grande no âmbito da Unesco, desse movimento forte da educação e da educação popular, conseguir agregar e fazer uma grande rede de solidariedade visando a transformação social. Um abraço.
Thank you, Professor Soares. Thank you to our amazing panel. I know I've learned so much and I'm so inspired. So thank you for your time and your participation. And I'll turn it back to Paulo.
Well, thank you all again for this amazing and historic panel. I'm sure if you look at the comments, you see how amazed people were about all that you've been talking about. It's a real honor for us to host you here. I just want to mention that this event has been coordinated and promoted by a group of Brazilian students. Not all of them are here because some of them have class, but Renata Penalva, Isabel Souza, Lívia Macedo, Juliana Gomes, and Marcelo Winter, who is here and who will now talk about the panels that we have tomorrow. So thank you very much, all of you, and see you tomorrow. Marcelo.
Para encerrar o terceiro dia do evento, nós gostaríamos de agradecer aos painelistas, professora Glória Ladson-Billings e aos professores Carlos Alberto Torres e Leôncio Soares, a moderadora, professora Sônia Horsford e todas e todos os participantes. E queremos também relembrar que o evento em comemoração ao centenário de Paulo Freire continua amanhã, quarta-feira, dia 8 de dezembro, às 5 horas da tarde em Nova York e 7 da noite no horário de Brasília. O tema da mesa será como reler o trabalho de Paulo Freire no mundo e vamos olhar para exemplos na arte e na cultura. Teremos como moderadoras 2 alunas de Teachers College, Columbia University, e também organizadoras dessa conferência, Renata Penalva e Marcela Winter, e como painelistas o poeta Sérgio Vaz e Cristiano Burlan, diretor do documentário Paulo Freire, um Homem do Mundo. Esperamos todos vocês para as discussões amanhã. Uma boa noite e até lá. Okay, we stop recording. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure to hear you. And yeah, see you around.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Obrigada.
Thanks, Gabriela.